Hi, and welcome to the Dispatches from a Wounded Country panel. My name is Jazmine Ulloa, and I'm a national political reporter with the Boston Globe. I'm based in DC and have spent much of the past 2 years on the road covering the 2020 presidential campaign. But I'm originally from El Paso, which I still very much consider home. And I've worked for the Brownsville Herald, the Austin American-Statesman, and the San Antonio Express News. So it's very good to be back, if only virtually. And I am very, very, very honored to be here and to be moderating this conversation with Cristina Rivera Garza. Cristina is a professor at the University of Houston and a foremost voice in contemporary Mexican literature. She is known for her dark subject matter and hybrid styles, her focus on women and marginalized people, and for challenging the way we think about borders, the state, and the body. Her latest book, Grieving, translated by Sarah Booker, is one of two nonfiction books Cristina has published in English translation late last year, and it's a compendium, a beautiful compendium of short crónicas, journalism, and personal essays on systematic violence in contemporary Mexico and along the US-Mexico border. Drawing together from literary theory and historical analysis, she outlines how neoliberalism, corruption, and drug trafficking, culminating in the misnamed war on drugs, has shaped her country, and working with and against this political context, she posits that collective grief is an act of resistance against state violence, and that writing is a powerful mode of seeking social justice and embodying resilience. All right, with that really long preamble, I was hoping we could start with you just telling us a little bit about your book. I know that you were writing a weekly column for the Mexican newspaper Milenio for 7 years, and that this is a mix of works that you've written for at least the past decade. But I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about how you selected the works in the book, what the book's access was, and what the set of questions you were asking going in that really binds the whole book together.
Well, thank you. Yes, of course. Thank you, Jazmine, for this conversation. And I really appreciate your careful reading of this book. And thank you for the invitation for this wonderful festival. So I'm very happy to be here. Let me see. Grieving has been a work in progress. And you are right, it began some years ago, a decade almost ago, when a very young editor from an independent press located in the southern state of Oaxaca thought of the possibility of this book. This is not something that I was writing with the intention of writing a whole unit, a book as such. It was a series, these articles, these texts, where my immediate reaction vis-a-vis a situation that was becoming increasingly complex, less and less clear to me, and a situation that was becoming just so close to home. It is a book, I think, at its very heart about a misnamed war, the so-called war on drugs, and how it has translated over the years in a war against us, dwellers and inhabitants of Mexico, and in addition and by connection with all the many Mexicos that are very much alive within the territory of the United States. So in the book, I was trying to understand why did this happen? What kind of structural forces made this war possible? And I knew, I had felt it in my own flesh, the pain that unrestricted, spectacular violence related to this war was causing in the population in general. And I started to pay attention. And writing at the very heart is precisely that, this pain of attention, this deep listening, I believe. So what I noticed is that there were many things, many issues that were not touched upon in public forums, in the newspapers, in TV and programs, and yet there was an undercurrent, a very stable conversation taking place in private homes, in small friend circles, in which pain played an increasingly important role. And what I noticed is that the language of pain that sometimes came disguised or wrapped, so to speak, with words that we took from, I don't know, from medicine, from religion, from some other discipline, so to speak, that we were trying to figure out all together what was happening, what to do about that. And so I thought that the common subject of many of these conversations was precisely social suffering, the way in which this situation was affecting us personally and as a community. The issue with paying attention to pain, to the language of pain, is that what I noticed is that the question that we were asking, or that we were trying to phrase with this language, it was obviously about what connects us, but also it was about the sources of the misfortune, the sources of tragedy. And so in that sense, it seems to me that this pain was, this language, this conversation was a very critical one. It was asking the same question that I was trying to ponder. How come we are enmeshed in the situation, and what can we do as a community to get out of this? And the question, phrased like that might seem very simple. It is obviously very complicated. And I think the reason why many of us and many communities throughout Mexico were using and are using the language of social suffering, the language of pain, is because it relates deeply and organically to the body, and it gives us a sense of how alert we are about what is going on and about the possibilities into the future.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That's beautiful. You touched on several things there. As reporters, I started in Brownsville. I graduated after the 2008 recession, so there were like no jobs anywhere. But I thought, if I'm going to be at a small paper, I want to be back on the frontera. Like I want to be covering my people, my community. And so I was at the Brownsville Herald when the violence was rising, and I had to read your book very slowly. I mentioned this in our email. I had to read it very slowly. I would stop and I would sit with the language, and yeah, it occurred to me that we were having these conversations, like you're saying, and it felt like it unearthed a lot of pain that was still buried within, that I hadn't fully acknowledged or fully processed. Like it's always there. Like even when I'm covering stories today, it's still there. So it occurred to me that I was grieving, and it felt like I was grieving with you. And I was wondering whether that was what you were trying, when you say you were trying to tap into that, if that's what you were trying to tap into. And then if you could speak to that collective grief, how does it transform into an act of resistance, or is just that feeling resistance itself? Makes sense. Yeah.
Thank you so much. First of all, for just sharing that personal reaction to the book. I think in many ways that's precisely what books or writing in general allows us to do. It's to be connected, to be part of a larger conversation. And it seems to me that grieving as such is something, I said it very explicitly too in the book. Grieving is not something that we do on our own. Grieving is, we never grieve in first person singular. We grieve for someone, for a situation, and with others as well. And so there is such a power in doing that, in the work of caring for others, of feeling, what other body might have gone through or might be feeling at that specific point. I'm talking about empathy at its basics, but at the same time about the possibility of building with others what some people have called emotional communities. So we all shared a common wound, and just being conscious about that. I think that there is such a possibility there to move forward together without denying what has been the connection in the first place. So there is other issue that you mentioned in your question that I think is extremely relevant: the pain that we don't know we harbor within ourselves, the pain that we carry with us, sometimes lacking the language, able to identify what it is, and we don't know until someone else calls it by its name, and then it becomes so clear. That happened to me so many times when I was writing those early texts back some years ago, that the more I listened to these conversations, to this undercurrent, as I called that at the beginning, the more I realized that I might have lacked that language, that specific language, but the people had been building that language. You know, sufferers, communities of sufferers have been doing that tremendously important and agonic work too, of providing specific words to situations that before then were simply unthinkable. And so just when this paying attention came with the gift of this language, it opened up a series of processes, among them the healing process too. So I was able to recognize, to acknowledge the pain that I was also carrying within myself, and it was deeply personal, but at the same time it was deeply shared. But that was something that is not. I don't see myself as a writer who is, you know, providing these words, but just the opposite, as someone who's worked with language and whose attention to what is going on in a range of communities has made it possible to identify what is there, what language is being used, what power we are generating together based on situations that have rendered us vulnerable and in many cases defenseless, you know, vis-a-vis situations of incredible horror. So if yeah, and if horror, as I argue in the book, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but just this last thing, it seems to me that as Adriana Caballero has so persuasively argued, horror's goal is to render us voiceless, paralyze us, to be unable to articulate precisely, to articulate what is happening before our eyes. It seems to me that writing and this deeply connected writing as a way of as this attention, as this deep listening, might make that articulation possible. So vis-a-vis the power of horror, we have the attention, the care, the listening to provide back the bridges that we need in order to cross and articulate feeling and action too.
Yeah, and I was actually that was going to be my next question. Actually, was that other side of the spectrum, the horror. There was a really great phrase in The Nation in an article about you that mentioned about that inherent in this violence that we find in the border are these questions about language and how do you define the violence and how do you write and speak against it. I thought that was very powerful because I've been thinking about that violence, and again, you know. And what you're talking about, that pain that we don't even know we have that language, that we don't have a language for, that we don't realize that we're carrying within us. I mean, I felt so many times throughout your book. You talk about the generations of young Juarenses who had to stay inside their homes and couldn't go out because of you know, the violence right outside their doors, and how they didn't believe their parents until, you know, these massacres were happening at parties. Like we used to go out in Juarez, and Juarez used to be like Avenida Juarez. You know, I grew up listening to stories from my grandmother who, you know, would go out in the 50s all night long, and my mom would go out all night long, and they would eat menudo in the mornings. And so we we watched that transformation, and I got to experience some of that even, you know, growing up in high school as well. And so I got to experience that, some of that, and then eventually it's like what you were saying at the very beginning, like this horror was happening around us, and we didn't really know how to process it or cover it. And I think a lot of reporters from Texas that were covering the drug war, like I was, also feel like they missed the story a little bit, that we weren't doing that deep listening that you're talking about. So that's very important to remember, and especially now where it seems like there's such a lack of empathy.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, that's one of the major issues, right? That neoliberal ideologies in general, this emphasis on individualism, sometimes, and de-emphasizing the place of the role of bodies in our social life, very often make us believe that we do all on our own, that we are self-made men and women, and that we do not depend on others. And I think if we have learned something during these months in the pandemic, is that we are deeply dependent on others, and that the health of one person is the possibility, is the life or death possibility of another one, and that what we touch or the air that we breathe keeps us together in very organic and complicated and politically charged ways. So just fighting against that indifference, it seems to me that indolence, it's in the activist form of indifference. I think indifference prevents us from just considering ourselves part of a larger whole, diminishes the role of communities in our own life, and in general, this empowers us. And so I see grieving, the work of grieving, this coming together that transverses all these rituals and these practices as a powerful activity, an activity powerful enough to at least to dispel the influence of indifference. I think is so ingrained, especially in these ideas about the individualistic ideas that we sometimes inherit and don't question enough. So when I was working on grieving, I didn't want to share the idea that this is a fatalistic work, that I'm kind of championing the place of victims as passive actors in their own tragedies. It's just the opposite. I really think that just as you said, when you realize that you are part of that, when you realize that there is a pain, a comparable pain, if not the same one, but something that might relate, something happens in us, and there is no way back. You cannot undo that very organic sensation that whatever happens out there to people that you might think you are unrelated to, in fact, will come back and affect you. And so it seems to me that this work of grieving is a work of keeping ourselves alert and keeping ourselves connected. And in order to do so, I think that first opening, that first embracing of our condition as members of larger communities is just so relevant and so important. And to me, writing might contribute to that work. It's not the only one, of course. I mean, there is oral history, there are narratives that we share at so many other levels. But to me, writing, just sharing that in a text, whether on a screen or on paper or in a talk just like now, there is a value there that I just cannot emphasize enough. Books and written text have shaped my life, have changed my life in many ways. I like to think that that's still a possibility in the world in which we live.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It's beautiful. Your book also it's so rare in that it encapsulates that urgency and the immediacy of the now. I mean, it seems very like you said, it's just very relevant, but it still has that passage of time. And I'm wondering how you approached having both of that history, that sweep of history, but also the presence.
Yeah, no, that's so important. And in that question is specifically relevant for the translation. I was at the beginning, I was a little bit hesitant about how relevant, how pertinent this book would be now, 10 years later. Sadly, I have to say that it is relevant. Many of as I was rereading and trying to make a selection and adding new texts too, I had to admit that a lot of the arguments that I have been working on, that I've been using to explain a range of phenomena, were still very much with us. And that this grieving work, this work with others in regards to violence and sudden death, and was still important socially, politically. So I decided to go ahead with the new collection in English. And as I said earlier, there were a couple of texts that were not as pertinent as others. And I had been writing about situations that had developed over the years. Pieces on women's mobilizations, for example, were new. They are original to this English version. They are not yet into the versions in Spanish. The last essay on the pandemic, obviously, that was also new. There were pieces that I had been working on, and I hadn't found a place to share, and they found a place here. The piece that you referred to a little while ago on growing up in Ciudad Juarez during these years, for example, is something that I wrote in connection to a little book, a little precious book that gathered testimonies of writers and just the people who lived in Ciudad Juarez during those years. And I thought, this is such a mine, such a precious tip of information right here. Is I didn't have time to go ahead and do these interviews in Ciudad Juarez, but this book just displayed in great detail how young people managed to survive with dignity under these very extreme circumstances. So I took advantage of these new recent publications. I was writing, I was following very closely what was happening with women's mobilization, feminist organizations in Mexico and throughout the world. And so I had to add these pieces just to keep it very there in the present. I think much of my work, it's at least that's what I attempt. I don't know how successful I am, but even though I might be talking about issues that happened back in 1910 in an insane asylum, like I did in No One Will See Me Cry, the novel, or I might be exploring the making of the border in the 1930s in between, Texas and Tamaulipas, and how cotton played an important role there. And it might seem that this is just relevant for people who are interested in the past, in the 1930s. And yet we know, or my argument is, that those questions emerged from the present, emerged from the urgency that is attached to the tragedy that is taking place on our borders. So it makes sense to me to ask what was happening in the 1930s in between Texas and Tamaulipas, because there are caravans of migrants trying to cross those borders right now, as I was writing that book, and making that connection, saying that the past is never the past, that it is with us, and that perhaps the task of language is to unearth to the sediment, to lift up the sediments of experience, and to let us see the connections between phenomena that we think that are lost in the past. They are not. They are with us. And I think it's that sense of layered presentness that I am very concerned with, and that I'm trying to tap into. And I do believe that there is some energy, there is some critical energy there that might help us visualize what is to come. How can we participate in the making of a different world in these years to come?
I love that. I love that idea of the layers. It reminds me of covering the El Paso shooting in Walmart, and how people could trace a direct line from the language that the shooter wrote online in this online tweet to President Trump. But you could even trace it back further and further, all dating all the way back to the 1910s, if you wanted to. Like, it wasn't a new type of rhetoric. There weren't new nativist ideas. It had been kind of like a timeless tension. So that's very fascinating.
Yeah, let me just add to what you just said. There is this timeless connection between the language of racism and discrimination and all that kind of thing. But a student of UT El Paso, the MFA in creative rights, in bilingual creative writing, wrote this powerful poem too about that massacre. Unfortunately, I don't remember her name right now, but she's a wonderful writer, and the poem is being circulating around. The point that I'm trying to make is that it's not only the language of of authority, of racism that is alive and well, and that we have to find a way to dismantle, but it's also this other language of dignity, of awareness, of care and resistance that lives with us, and that has been allowing us to survive with that kind of with that kind of presence, with that kind of energy of spirit too. So I think it's always very important to just to talk about both of them, about that interconnection. Otherwise, it would be very difficult to explain how come we are such a powerful communities in the United States. How come we've been able to survive for so many years under very, very difficult circumstances.
That's excellent. Yes, that's a great point to remember. And I wish I could remember. I did see that poem. It was it's amazing too how it was. I saw it in different forms too, in Instagram and on Twitter. So it that in itself was like an art. I'm going to ask a question from the audience here. What do you think are some of the biggest misconceptions among Americans regarding what's happening on the other side of the border? From Avery Eustace.
Well, I think these misconceptions are not only they don't belong to Americans only. I think when we think of the United States and Mexico as separate entities, when we are not able to realize that there are many Mexicos alive and well, developing entire lives within what we know as the United States, I think we're talking about misconception. Our lives and our destiny is so enmeshed and so together that and that's one of the reasons why when we were talking about the translation of Grieving, I thought that whatever was discussed there was also pertinent for those of us who live on this side of the border. Whatever happens in Mexico has a huge repercussion on family members and members of interconnected communities that live here. So to begin with, I think that's extremely important, and something that Jazmine had emphasized earlier, that there is a shared history behind us. This is not something new. That we need to, if we want to develop critical tools to think our present moment, it would be in our own benefit to think back and to trace back and to see the many ways in which both power and its many contestations have made this border that we share. And the other thing that I was trying to critically explore in this book is that it seems to me that, and this is especially true, I think, in the United States, that we live in a society that is always very hesitant about pain. And we're able to watch violence for hours in TV. We're able to take pretty much everything in. But once we touch pain, there is this kind of distance. There is this fear, as though this is something that we shouldn't talk about openly. There is a hush-hush moment around that. And it seemed to me that that is very, very connected to the fact that we live in a society that very often de-emphasizes the very fact that we live in bodies, and the bodies age, and that we die, right? And so that disconnect taints the indifference that we were talking about, the erroneous belief that we don't depend on others. And so I see writing, or one of the possibilities of writing, is to work within that realm, just to bring back that ultimate reality that we are bodies that need other bodies, and that we're bodies that age, that suffer, and that experience and pain in many, many ways. So just lifting the veil about this manifold experience of pain, I think is so critically relevant, especially right now. We have all experienced so much loss over the last year. And if we don't grieve, if we don't do that work with others, we're going to be missing a very important possibility right now. And the possibility to me is that we don't go back to normal as we know of it. The possibility right now is that if we acknowledge the loss, the massive loss that we are going through as a result of the pandemic, and as a result of many other forms of violence, shootings, for example, too. Mm-hmm. If we don't embrace the fact that we are in pain, we're going to miss the opportunity to build a new sense of what normal is. We're going to miss the opportunity of critically revise what our sense of normality is. And so I am, in many ways, just energized by that possibility. And to me, there are many factors, of course, contributing to that stance as we go into the future. But one of them, I think, an indispensable one, is that we have to admit that we pain, that we suffer, that we have lost, and the loss is intrinsic to our experience here on Earth, and that's a kind of clarity, alertness that grief, social grief, that the act of grieving, the wake work, as Christina Sharp has called it in this wonderful book, on Blackness and Being. So the wake work, the grieving work that might allow us to see a different future. And that to me is very relevant in the reading and the sharing of this book.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's the other thing. You know, your book was very much about contemporary violence in contemporary Mexico and along the border. But in others, you've talked about this too in other interviews, how you really connected to like that global. It's more like of a global pain, global. You know, it's a global language, right? It's like that language of grief. And so I think that's one of the reasons why, you know, as I was grieving with you, as I was reading the book and grieving with you, and I was also like going through other moments of pain, I kept coming back to El Paso, and that's really interesting what you're saying, because in the days after the shooting, people talked a lot about El Paso being an inflection point and a chance to mobilize Latino voters, and especially young Latino voters. But I kept talking to older Latinos, Mexican Americans, and talking to friends about. So I was having like interviews with voters, but I was also having like really personal conversations with my family about crossing and about that rhetoric and about that resistance as well. So I was having, it was like multi-layered, right? but the thing that I kept hearing from a younger generation, whether it was my friends or whether it was like young people I was meeting out on the trail, was like, my parents don't want to talk about it, or they just don't, they think we need to just move on, and they just don't want to process. Well, what would you say to that younger generation? Like, how do you build that connection with people who don't, yeah, with your elders, yeah.
By the way, I have the name of the poet, Alessandra Narváez Varela. That's
thank you for getting it. Yeah.
23 reasons why. 23 reasons. I think that's the name of the poem, the title of the poem, and you know, perhaps sharing this poem with your parents is not a bad idea. You know, just showing what others have thought and have felt empowered to share in different languages, the language of poetry, the language of journalism, the many different and really moving ways in which we realized what others have gone through. Sometimes we don't open up because the fear, the pain will be so overwhelming that will take us with it is just so huge. And sometimes we are not in the position where we're not strong enough at that point to take it in, and we have to respect that too. But it seems to me, and at least that's the argument of the book, that the more we listen to people who have gone through that, the more, even if we do it in silence, even if we do it in a very discreet way, when we start to open up our senses and just find out that this is a shared condition, that this is something that we're going to be able to go through on our own, I think that eventually will take us to that place where we can acknowledge what is happening within us as well. But gaining that language, being able to recognize, so that if that person is describing that situation in that specific way, and then you say, wow, that just happens to me too. That's something that I can identify with. At the very basic, that's something that writing does, and that's the reason why I go back to that poem. Just sharing something as powerful as that could be tremendously liberating too.
Got it. And then you going back to the language, you speak a lot in interviews about this interplay between English and Spanish and wanting to explore that friction, that tension between the two. Can you share a few words on that? What do you mean by that, and how do you test the limits of each language?
Of using both English and Spanish to do that. Bueno, tenemos la gran fortuna de que muchos de los que nos interesan o estamos tal vez presentes aquí, tiene mucho sentido en San Antonio que somos bilingües, ¿no? So I always repeat whenever I have a chance, at the slightest provocation, that I live in the second largest Spanish-speaking country in the world. I live in the United States. And within, we are about, 50, 60 million Spanish speakers in this country. And then 10, 11 million of bilinguals. So I'm talking pretty much of a lingua franca, not a foreign language at all. So moving freely within, from English to Spanish and all the many gradations in between, I think just allows us to expand our sense of what do we belong to? And the answer is varied, and I welcome all of them. So recently I was asked, well, how do you define yourself? Since I was born in Mexico, right? And I grew up speaking Spanish, but I've been living now for many years in this country, more years now in the United States than the ones that I lived in Mexico. And then I just wrote a book, Autobiografía del Algodón, in which I was exploring the migrant experience of my maternal grandparents, for example, who had crossed the border the U.S.-Mexico border when they were kids, and they lived all their lives in the United States. And in the 1930s, they were forced back into Mexico when President Hoover was issuing as racist legislation as the one that we just saw happening these last 4 years. So I was thinking, well, and that makes me a Latino too. I mean, a Latino who grew up in Mexico, but who can trace back this lineage of migration and work to the early 20th century. And again, see, learning that history is so important. Just to be able to claim the territory, to claim the languages that come with the territory, and so that's I see that as a gift too, as a tool, just to be able to move in between all these different ways of speaking and understanding reality. And that must happen to you, Jazmine, too. You are one person when you speak in Spanish, or another one when you're speaking in English, and you are yet another one when you're combining both of them, and that is a richness that we bring into this world as migrants. And I think it's just so relevant, aesthetically speaking, and obviously politically speaking as well.
Yeah, it's also interesting how people react to me. Like on the East Coast, people never know but the further west I go, if I'm traveling for a story, people automatically just start speaking to me in Spanish. Like it's just like, ¿Dónde queda esta sala? You know, it's like no question. You know, like. So there's another question from Janet Miller. Oh,
I'm sorry, and that happens to me in Houston so often. I live in a historically Mexican neighborhood, and I have an aunt who's lived there for, I don't know, 50 years. She speaks Spanish, very little English, and she's had a fulfilling life. It seems, I don't know, the power of Spanish, of speaking in Spanish, of writing in Spanish, I think is as important as ever. And in terms of literature, it seems to me that a very good chunk of what is called Latin American literature is being written from within the United States, sometimes in Spanish and sometimes in English, but in this very organic conversation with Latin American or Spanish-speaking literary traditions. And that's another phenomenon that is so interesting too.
Yeah. So we only have a couple minutes left. Janet Miller was asking, what politician do you feel is the most effective advocate to help change the crisis? I don't think it means like the name, but I'm wondering if the question is, from everything we've talked about, it seems like we're talking about language outside of this typical political.
My answer to that question would be, if you want me to name a name, I would say Janet Miller. I would say Jazmine Ulloa. I'd say Cristina Rivera Garza, because we are the ones who advocate. We're the ones who can press our politicians, whoever they are, to pay attention to their constituents. We are the ones who can bring this language into the public arena and say, hey, people, pay attention to this. This is hurting us. This needs to be taken care of. You are there in that office to serve. And so we are those politicians. The connections that we're able to forge among ourselves. That's the kind of power that we can bring into that public discussion. And I think it's always a bad idea to relinquish that, to give away that power. I don't believe that voting for this, for X or Y, should be the extent of my activity as a citizen, right? Or as someone who is concerned, as a dweller. I hate to use the word citizen, as a dweller of this world, right? Yeah, that's what we are here to do. And deep down, I think that books, as old-fashioned as they are, you know, as varied as they might become, they still have that seed of that potency, that possibility in them. And that's the reason why I keep writing them.
Excellent. Yeah, that's a great way to end it. We only have one more minute, and I definitely saw that throughout the election. You had this younger, smaller group of Latinos who were saying that very thing, like, and we're demanding more from both parties, not just one, and really bringing that language of activism to the political sphere. I just want to give you a minute if there's any closing statement you'd like to make, or any other words you'd like to leave the audience with.
I just want to thank you, Jazmine, for your questions and your reading and this interaction. I want to thank the festival. I invite you, all of you who are present now, who might be watching this recording later, to delve into the book and to open up to the possibilities that the work of grieving can bring into our lives.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the conversation today.
Bye-bye.